The story begins with a black woman named Maya as she steps into the busy airport terminal, ready for her business trip. She was a confident, successful woman in her late 30s, well-dressed in a sharp blazer and tailored trousers. Maya had worked hard to get to where she was, rising through the ranks of a well-known company. Today, she was flying out to oversee an important meeting with potential investors. The flight was just a part of her packed schedule, but she was determined to make the most of it, bringing her usual focus and calm to the task ahead. As she walked towards the gate, Maya could feel the bustling energy of the airport. People rushed in every direction, some with luggage in hand, others waiting for their boarding calls. She felt comfortable in this environment, having traveled often for work. Maya showed her boarding pass and quickly made her way onto the plane. As she stepped into the cabin, she noticed that the flight attendants were busy greeting other passengers and guiding them to their seats. The atmosphere on the plane was lively, but it felt like another regular flight for Maya. She took her seat in first class, a comfortable spot where she could relax before the flight took off. Her mind raced through her upcoming meetings, making sure everything was prepared. But as she settled in, the flight attendant walked up to her aisle, a young woman with bright eyes and a pleasant smile. The flight attendant briefly glanced at her ticket before turning back to Maya, speaking in a tone that was unusually dismissive. "Excuse me, ma'am, but you need to move your bag from the seat next to you." "That's not your space," the attendant said, her voice lacking warmth. Maya raised an eyebrow, surprised by the comment. She had placed her bag under the seat in front of her, following the airline's guidelines. However, the attendant seemed determined to find something to correct, her tone growing sharper. "I'm sorry, but that's not how we do things here. You should move it," the flight attendant insisted, as if speaking to someone who didn't understand the basic rules. Maya was taken aback by the rude attitude. She wasn't a nervous traveler, and she knew all the flight protocols well. But what struck her the most was the way the attendant had spoken, as though Maya were a beginner, unfamiliar with proper conduct on the plane. Maya looked at the attendant for a moment, collecting her thoughts. She didn't want to make a scene, but the flight attendant's behavior was starting to rub her the wrong way. Still, she remained calm, nodding politely and adjusting her bag. It seemed like a simple misunderstanding, but Maya could already tell that the interaction wasn't going to be as smooth as she had hoped. As the plane began to fill with passengers, the flight attendant continued to move up and down the aisles, greeting people with a fake smile, doing her job in a robotic, almost detached way. Maya observed her, trying to focus on her work. She had already experienced her share of challenges in her career, but this wasn't the kind of thing she was used to, being treated with such subtle disrespect for no reason at all. The flight attendant would pass by from time to time, never acknowledging Maya with anything more than a quick glance. As the plane took off and the seatbelt sign blinked off, Maya leaned back in her chair, trying to get comfortable for the long flight ahead. She tried not to let the flight attendant's behavior bother her too much, but in the back of her mind, a small feeling of irritation kept bubbling up. Maya's thoughts were interrupted as the flight attendant returned once more. She stopped at Maya's row, eyes scanning her seating arrangements. Her eyes lingered a bit too long on Maya, then quickly shifted away. Maya noticed, but didn't say anything. The subtle condescension in the attendant's eyes hadn't escaped her, but she was determined not to let it distract her. She had bigger things to focus on. Little did the flight attendant know, Maya was far more than she appeared. She wasn't just a regular passenger on this flight. She was someone who had worked tirelessly to earn her place at the top, someone who could influence this flight's operation and management. But for now, Maya chose to keep her identity hidden, sensing that the flight attendant had already made up her mind about her. The journey was just beginning, but Maya knew she had a decision to make. How far would she let this behavior go before she stepped in to correct it? The flight continued smoothly, the hum of the engines filling the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Maya took out her laptop, preparing to go over some notes for her upcoming meeting. She was a professional, always ready for whatever came her way. And today was no different. Despite the brief, uncomfortable exchange with the flight attendant, she knew she had more important things to focus on. Yet she couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was the way the attendant had treated her, dismissive, almost as if she didn't belong. As the seatbelt sign flickered off, passengers began to relax, some chatting with their neighbors, others pulling out books or plugging in headphones. Maya glanced out the window for a moment, taking in the view of the sky stretching endlessly. But her peace was short-lived when the flight attendant came down the aisle again, this time holding a tray of drinks for the first-class passengers. She stopped at Maya's row, offering a drink with a polite, yet stiff smile. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" Maya looked up, noticing the flight attendant's forced friendliness. It was as if she had rehearsed the line but couldn't quite make it genuine. Maya smiled back, choosing the simple water. "Water, please," she said, keeping her voice calm and polite, despite the growing discomfort. The flight attendant handed her the drink, but before Maya could take it, the attendant's eyes lingered for a moment too long. Maya's calm demeanor stayed intact, but the situation began to feel uncomfortable. The flight attendant's gaze shifted between Maya and the other passengers around her, clearly making an effort to avoid eye contact for too long. "Here you go," the attendant said, her voice colder this time. She handed the water over a little too quickly, almost as if she were trying to get the interaction over with. Maya noticed this, and for a split second, her mind wandered back to the earlier exchange. Why was this happening? It wasn't just the rude comments or the dismissive attitude. It felt personal, as if the flight attendant had made a judgment about her that had nothing to do with her actions. Maya accepted the drink quietly, her fingers brushing the attendant's hand just for a second. She wondered if the flight attendant even realized how obvious her discomfort was becoming. As she took a sip, Maya glanced around the cabin, trying to shift her focus away from the tension. She could hear the flight attendant speaking to other passengers in a much warmer tone, even laughing softly at one point. Maya had heard the way the attendant spoke to others. Nothing like how she had treated her. It was subtle but noticeable. As the flight moved further along, the attendant continued her rounds, never once checking back on Maya. She moved past, pretending as though Maya wasn't even there. This only made the feeling of being ignored more apparent. Maya couldn't understand what she had done to deserve this treatment. She wasn't causing any problems. She wasn't asking for special attention. But the constant dismissiveness was hard to ignore. Maya's mind drifted to her past experiences. She had faced biases before, but nothing like this. Nothing so blatant. She had worked in environments where people often underestimated her, assuming her success came from something other than hard work. But she was used to handling such situations with grace. Still, the flight attendant's behavior was starting to test her patience. She tried to shake off the annoyance, focusing back on her notes, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, one that wouldn't go away. She knew she wasn't imagining things. She could feel the judgment, the quiet assumptions being made about her. It wasn't about the seat, the drink, or the bag. It was something deeper, a kind of unspoken bias that she had come to recognize over the years. Maya couldn't help but wonder if this was a sign of things to come. Would she have to face more of this during her trip, or would she get a chance to show the world the true depth of who she was? Whatever happened, she knew she would handle it with strength. But for now, she decided to stay quiet and observe. There was no need to make a scene. She would let the flight attendant continue her behavior for now. But Maya had a feeling the day's events were far from over. The flight continued, and Maya tried her best to focus on her work, but the flight attendant's behavior was weighing on her mind. As the plane soared high above the clouds, Maya could hear the soft murmur of conversations around her. The sound of the flight attendants making their way down the aisles, the clinking of glasses, and the distant hum of the engine all blended together. But none of this could drown out the unease she felt after her interactions with the young flight attendant. Maya glanced at her watch, about halfway through the flight now. She decided to take a break from her notes and stretch her legs. She stood up and walked to the back of the cabin to use the restroom. On her way, she passed the flight attendant, who was busy chatting with a colleague near the galley. The attendant saw Maya walking toward her but didn't greet her. Instead, she glanced at her briefly, not offering any acknowledgement. Maya couldn't help but notice the flight attendant's body language. It was stiff, almost as if Maya was invisible to her. Maya walked past, doing her best to keep her composure. She didn't want to make a scene, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the growing tension. She had experienced subtle biases in the workplace before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the small disrespectful gestures. It was about being treated as though she didn't belong. She reached the restroom, closed the door behind her, and leaned against the wall for a moment. Maya sighed, taking a deep breath as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She was a successful professional, with a track record of hard work and dedication. She had earned every ounce of respect she received from her colleagues and clients. But here, on this plane, she was being treated as if she were invisible, as if she wasn't even worthy of basic courtesy. Maya was no stranger to challenges. In her career, she had faced more than her share of obstacles, most of them stemming from people who underestimated her abilities because of her race or her gender. But this felt different. The flight attendant had made her feel like an outsider, like she didn't belong in the space she had every right to be in. When she left the restroom, Maya noticed the flight attendant was still standing near the galley, speaking with a passenger in first class. The attendant's demeanor had changed. She was now laughing and chatting comfortably with the passenger, offering a friendly smile. Maya paused, noticing the stark contrast between how the attendant treated the other passengers and how she treated her. It was clear now. The flight attendant wasn't simply doing her job. There was something more to it, something unspoken. The way the attendant had looked at her earlier, the way she had spoken to her, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. There was a judgment there, a preconceived notion about who Maya was. Maya felt the weight of the situation, but she refused to let it get the better of her. She had worked too hard to let anyone's narrow-mindedness affect her. Still, the thought lingered. Why was she being treated this way? Was it because of how she looked, or was there something else at play? She couldn't be sure, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't something she could just brush off. As she made her way back to her seat, Maya took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind. She wasn't going to let this situation define her. She would stay composed, stay professional, and make sure that her experience here didn't go unnoticed. The flight wasn't over yet, and neither was the subtle battle for respect. As the flight continued, Maya settled back into her seat, trying to shake off the growing frustration she felt. The flight attendant had returned to her duties, gliding through the aisles with a cold efficiency, speaking to passengers with an almost robotic politeness. But Maya couldn't help noticing the stark difference between how the attendant treated the other first-class passengers and how she had treated her. The attendant was more than cordial with the other guests, smiling warmly, and even making small talk with a few of them. But Maya, she had received nothing but curt, dismissive behavior. Maya leaned back in her seat, trying to focus on the work in front of her. She had already reviewed the notes for her meeting, but now she found herself distracted, her mind replaying the awkward moments over and over. Why had the flight attendant been so dismissive? Was it just a misunderstanding, or was there something more to it? Maya had been in situations like this before, where people made assumptions about her based on her appearance, but this felt different. This wasn't just about being underestimated. It was something more personal, something deeper. She sighed and glanced out of the window. The sky stretched out endlessly before her, and for a brief moment, the vastness of it all made her feel small. But at the same time, it gave her a sense of perspective. She had faced worse challenges than this, and she had always come out stronger. This was no different. She wasn't going to let this one person's behavior ruin her flight or her trip. Maya was determined to stay focused and calm. The flight attendant came by again, this time with a cart of snacks for the passengers. As she approached, she paused at Maya's seat, her eyes quickly scanning her face before she offered a small, forced smile. "Would you like anything to eat, ma'am?" she asked, her voice almost mechanical. Maya glanced at the cart, deciding she wasn't hungry. But as she looked up at the flight attendant, she caught a glimpse of something behind the woman's eyes. It wasn't just indifference, it was something else. Maya couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it almost seemed like the attendant was avoiding her gaze. She was treating her like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. "No, thank you," Maya said calmly, her voice steady. She could feel her patience starting to wear thin, but she wasn't going to react. Reacting would only escalate things, and she wasn't going to give the flight attendant the satisfaction of seeing her riled up. She had been in situations like this before, where people tried to provoke her, trying to get a reaction. But Maya had learned long ago that staying calm and composed was always the best response. The flight attendant moved on, continuing down the aisle, but Maya could still feel the tension hanging in the air. She took a deep breath and tried to shake off the nagging feeling that the woman's behavior wasn't just about her. There was something personal in the way she acted, as though she had already made up her mind about who Maya was and what she deserved. As the plane cruised through the sky, Maya thought about how she could address this situation. She wasn't sure if confronting the flight attendant directly was the right move, but she didn't want to let this slide either. Maya was a professional, and she had worked too hard to get where she was to be treated like this by anyone, especially someone in a service role. She deserved respect, and it wasn't something she was willing to compromise on. Her thoughts were interrupted as the flight attendant returned to the front of the cabin. She didn't even glance in Maya's direction this time. Maya's mind was racing, but she took another deep breath, focusing on the fact that the flight was almost over. She would get through this, just like she had gotten through everything else in her life. This was just one more challenge to face, and she was determined to face it with grace and dignity. As the flight neared its destination, Maya sat quietly, her thoughts swirling in the calm of the cabin. She had tried her best to ignore the flight attendant's behavior, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been building up since the moment she stepped onto the plane. The attendant's dismissive attitude had not only affected her own experience, but also made Maya reflect on how often she had faced similar moments of judgment throughout her life. She had spent years working hard, proving herself capable, intelligent, and strong, yet people sometimes still saw only the surface, unaware of the depth behind it. Maya glanced around the cabin again, watching as the flight attendant moved with purpose, serving passengers and chatting with them in the same friendly tone she had reserved for everyone but Maya. Her laughter echoed across the cabin, and for a moment, Maya couldn't help but notice how easily the flight attendant connected with the other passengers. It was a stark contrast to how she had acted toward Maya. Maya's patience had worn thin, but she hadn't yet decided what to do about it. She wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but something about the way she had been treated didn't sit right with her. The flight attendant walked down the aisle once again, her eyes scanning the cabin. This time, however, she hesitated when she passed Maya's row, briefly making eye contact before quickly averting her gaze. Maya could sense that something had shifted in the air. Maybe it was the realization of who she was. Perhaps the flight attendant had heard something through the grapevine, or maybe she had pieced things together herself. Either way, the change in behavior was immediate and noticeable. The flight attendant, now visibly more cautious, stopped at a nearby passenger's seat, offering her usual polite smile. But this time, Maya wasn't the one to look away. She held the attendant's gaze for a brief moment, as if silently communicating something unspoken. The attendant quickly finished her task and walked away, her demeanor now noticeably different. Maya didn't smile or give any indication of forgiveness, but she had made a point. As the plane continued its descent, Maya found herself thinking about the power of perception. People often made assumptions based on surface-level observations, judging others for reasons that had nothing to do with who they truly were. She had spent a lifetime learning how to deal with those assumptions, how to navigate spaces where she was underestimated or overlooked. But this moment felt different. She had worked hard for everything she had achieved, and she had every right to expect respect from those around her, no matter their position, no matter their assumptions. The attendant returned to her seat at the front of the cabin, her eyes flicking briefly to Maya's seat before she turned her attention to her duties. For the first time, Maya noticed that the woman seemed almost unsure of herself, as though she was trying to reconcile her actions with the reality of who Maya was. But it was too late for that. The damage had already been done, and Maya wasn't in the business of accepting hollow apologies. As the plane finally began to land, Maya straightened in her seat, preparing to disembark. She had stayed calm throughout the flight, focused on the bigger picture, but now, as the wheels touched the runway, she couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. This was just another lesson, one that had taught her how important it was to demand respect and not allow anyone to treat her as less than she was. Maya stood up, gathering her belongings and readying herself to exit the plane. She made a mental note to address the issue later, but for now, she was content with the quiet strength she had shown throughout the flight. It wasn't about revenge or confrontation. It was about proving to herself that she could navigate this situation with grace, no matter how uncomfortable it had been. She had learned that sometimes the best response was not to react in anger, but to hold your head high and let your actions speak louder than words. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Maya gathered her things, her thoughts still swirling around the interactions with the flight attendant. The tension of the flight was starting to dissolve, but there was a lingering feeling that she couldn't simply let this go. Maya had dealt with many situations like this in the past, people making assumptions about her based on how she looked, or where she came from, or even the way she dressed. But this was different. This wasn't just about misunderstandings. It was about being treated like she didn't matter, like she wasn't even worthy of basic respect. She stood up slowly, carefully pulling her bag from under the seat. Her mind was still turning, trying to figure out what to do next. Maya wasn't someone who enjoyed confrontation, but she knew that sometimes silence spoke louder than words, and in this case it was clear to her that the flight attendant needed to understand the impact of her behavior. As people around her began to gather their things, preparing to leave the plane, Maya decided it was time to act. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, the passengers around her stood up, but Maya remained seated for a moment longer. She looked around the cabin, observing the flight attendants and their interactions with the passengers. The young flight attendant was busy at the front, helping passengers with their overhead bins, her face a mix of forced politeness and nervousness. Maya noticed the subtle change in her demeanor. It was clear the flight attendant had realized something. Maya took a deep breath and stood up, walking toward the front of the plane. The other flight attendants were busy with their duties, but the young attendant looked up as Maya approached. Their eyes met for a moment, and Maya could see the sudden shift in the attendant's expression. Recognition, mixed with a tinge of regret. "Excuse me," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant gave a quick, nervous smile, her hands stiff at her sides. She wasn't sure what to expect from Maya, but the tension was palpable. "I just wanted to speak with you for a moment," Maya continued. The words weren't confrontational, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in her tone. "I've noticed that you've been quite distant with me throughout the flight. I'm not sure why, but I felt that the way you treated me was different from how you treated the other passengers." The flight attendant's smile faltered for a brief second, and she looked down, shifting her weight nervously. "I'm really sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable. That wasn't my intention at all," she said, her voice shaky. Maya could see the sincerity in her eyes, but she also saw the realization that her actions had been wrong. She had crossed a line, even if she hadn't fully understood it at the time. Maya nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I know it might not have been intentional, but that doesn't change how it felt. I've worked very hard to get to where I am, and I don't expect to be treated like I'm invisible. I'm sure you understand that," Maya said, her words measured and composed. She wasn't angry. There was no need for that. But she needed to make sure the flight attendant understood the impact of her behavior. The flight attendant looked up at her face now flushed with embarrassment. I truly didn't mean to offend you. I don't know why I acted that way. I guess I just assumed. She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. Maya knew what she meant. It wasn't about what the flight attendant thought. It was about the assumptions she had made based on what she saw. Maya took a step back, allowing the attendant space to process. "It's okay," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But I hope you take this as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they do." The flight attendant nodded, her expression serious now. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "I won't forget this." Maya gave a small, polite nod and turned to walk back to her seat, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't raised her voice or caused a scene, but she had made her point clear. Maya knew that sometimes the most effective way to handle situations like this was with calm, direct communication. She hadn't needed to make the flight attendant feel bad, just to show her that people, no matter where they come from or how they look, deserve respect. As she returned to her seat, Maya reflected on how she had handled the situation. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. She didn't expect the flight attendant to change overnight, but perhaps this conversation would stick with her. A small reminder that respect should never be assumed, and that people were more than the labels others placed on them. As the plane landed and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Maya felt a sense of calm settle over her. The conversation with the flight attendant had gone as well as she had hoped. She had spoken her mind without raising her voice, without letting her frustration get the better of her. Now, all that was left was to disembark and continue her day. But the moment wasn't lost on her. She knew that what had happened on this flight would stick with both of them, for different reasons. For Maya, it was a reminder that even the smallest acts of disrespect should not be ignored, while for the flight attendant, it would likely serve as a learning experience. As she stood in the aisle, waiting for the line of passengers to clear, Maya took a moment to reflect on what had just transpired. In a way, she was proud of how she had handled things. Maya wasn't the type of person to seek confrontation, but she also knew that sometimes silence wasn't the best answer. It was important to speak up, to let others know when their behavior was hurtful or inappropriate. She had done that today, and although it had been uncomfortable, she knew it had been the right thing to do. When Maya reached the gate, she paused for a moment, watching the flight attendants as they prepared to exit the plane. The young flight attendant from earlier was still working, but now there was a noticeable difference in how she moved. Her posture seemed a little straighter, her smile a little warmer as she spoke to the other passengers. Maya couldn't help but notice how her demeanor had changed, and it gave her a sense of satisfaction to see that her words had had an impact. Maya grabbed her bag from the overhead bin and began walking toward the exit, but before she stepped off the plane, the flight attendant appeared in front of her. Her eyes met Maya's, and for a moment, the two women stood in silence. There was no tension now, just an understanding. "I just wanted to apologize again," the flight attendant said quietly, her voice sincere. "I didn't realize how I had come across, and I'm really sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable." Maya smiled softly, nodding. "It's okay. I just hope you take something from this. We all deserve respect, no matter where we come from or how we look." The flight attendant's expression softened, and she nodded in agreement. "I won't forget that. Thank you for talking to me." With that, Maya walked past her, heading toward the terminal. As she made her way through the airport, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had stood her ground and had done so with the kind of quiet dignity that had always served her well in the past. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but she did need to stand up for herself when it mattered. Today had been one of those times. Maya knew that this experience, though small in the grand scheme of things, had been a turning point for the flight attendant. It was a reminder that everyone, regardless of their job or background, deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. And for Maya, it had been a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lay in not reacting with anger, but in responding with calm assertiveness. She had made her point, and now it was time to move forward. Her day was just beginning, and while the flight was over, the lesson would linger in her mind for a long time to come. Sometimes, all it took was a simple conversation to change someone's perspective. Maya hoped that this was one of those times. She had shown that a person's worth could never be judged by appearances alone. As Maya walked through the terminal, she felt a sense of accomplishment settle in. The situation with the flight attendant, though small in the grand scheme of things, had felt like a significant moment. She had faced an uncomfortable situation head-on and had handled it with poise and grace. Maya didn't expect the world to change overnight, but she knew that standing up for herself in a calm and respectful way was always worth it. Her mind wandered as she made her way to baggage claim. She thought about how often people made assumptions based on appearances, how quickly someone could judge another without taking the time to understand who they really were. It wasn't just the flight attendant who had made assumptions about her. Maya had spent her entire life navigating these invisible barriers, facing prejudice in all forms, from subtle to overt. But each time, she had proven herself, not with words but through actions. She had built her career, established her reputation, and earned respect. No one could take that away from her. The flight attendant's apology, though brief, had meant something. Maya could see that the young woman truly didn't understand the impact of her behavior until it was pointed out to her. Maya didn't need an apology to feel vindicated. The conversation had been enough. But hearing the flight attendant acknowledge her actions made it clear that Maya's words had resonated. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest moments had the greatest impact. Maya reached the baggage claim area and stood there for a moment, waiting for her suitcase to appear on the conveyor belt. As she watched the bags roll by, she reflected on how far she had come. Every step of her journey had been marked by moments like this, times when she had been underestimated, overlooked, or treated unfairly. But she had never let that stop her. Instead, she had used each of those moments to fuel her ambition, to push herself even harder, to prove that she was worthy of every success she had achieved. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to check the message. It was from her assistant, confirming the details of her upcoming meetings. Maya smiled, feeling the surge of excitement. The work ahead of her was important, and she was ready for it. There was no room in her life for petty distractions or negativity. The world was full of people who would try to undermine others, but Maya had learned that it wasn't about what they said or thought. It was about what you believed about yourself and how you carried yourself. Her suitcase arrived, and she grabbed it from the conveyor belt, adjusting the handle as she headed toward the exit. As she walked toward the door, she glanced back toward the gate where the flight had landed, and a small thought crossed her mind. She wondered what the flight attendant was thinking now. Did she see things differently? Would she treat the next person with more kindness, with more awareness of how her actions affected others? Maya didn't know the answers, and honestly, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had done the right thing. She had used her voice in a way that wasn't aggressive or angry, but simply honest and firm. It had been a lesson, not just for the flight attendant, but for herself as well. She had reminded herself that standing up for respect was not a choice. It was a necessity. No one should ever have to feel less than because of who they are or how they look. As she stepped into the bright sunlight of the airport exit, Maya felt the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. She was moving forward, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. The flight attendant would continue her journey, just as Maya would continue hers. But in that brief moment, they had shared something important, a recognition of each other's humanity, and a promise to do better, both for themselves and for others. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was enough. It was a start.